I want to introduce our next speaker, who is Dr. Christopher TIMMERMANN. He got his Bachelor of Science in Chile and his Master's in Bologna, and he's currently getting his Ph.D. at Imperial College in London. He is leading a project focusing on the effects of DMT in the brain and consciousness. He is interested in the use of methods bridging the relationship between phenomenology and changes in brain activity by studying the effects of psychedelic compounds in human participants. Dr. TIMMERMANN will be speaking on the dynamics of brain activity and conscious experience induced by DMT.
Okay, thanks Julie for the introduction, and thank you Kevin for inviting me here to speak at Horizons. This is simply wonderful, really exciting. So I'm conducting my PhD research at Imperial College London, where I work in the Psychedelic Research Group. I am also part of ALUS, which is an interdisciplinary group for the study of non-ordinary states of consciousness, not just psychedelics. And I'm going to speak a bit about the research that we've been conducting in the past 3 years, in which we've been using DMT within the larger framework of consciousness science. Right? So I'd like to first just acknowledge the contribution of the Psychedelic Research Group members that have participated in this study, as well as our collaborators from the University of Oxford and the University of Geneva. So going back to the idea of consciousness research and how can we use psychedelic drugs to understand conscious experience. Our current models of consciousness from a scientific perspective are relatively rudimentary, right? So we usually think of consciousness as this sort of like line in which we either are conscious or are not conscious, right? So a state of unconsciousness would be one in which we are in a state of dreamless sleep, no contents unfolding during the experience. Nonetheless, when we think about psychedelic experiences, we're confronted with a completely different scenario. We no longer have the adequate models to account for what is happening in terms of conscious experience. So within this framework, any model of consciousness that doesn't account for this experience will be an incomplete model of consciousness. And when we're trying to understand or to map the terrain of these psychedelic experiences, and especially the ones that are induced by this very potent psychedelic, we're confronted with a difficult terrain. It's an unknown territory. And we're faced with two big challenges. So the first one concerns the study of first-person experience, the intimate aspects of experience. And the field of phenomenology has tried to understand this problem of experience and to grasp it in the best way possible. And it has faced the immense challenge of actually getting into the fine-grained aspects that make up our conscious experience. And many of them occur below the threshold of awareness. And when we think about psychedelic experience and the fact that they have the strong ineffable component in them, meaning that it's difficult for participants or people or users to put words into what the experience was, the challenge becomes double in a way. Then we have the challenge of neuroscience, understanding brain activity. Neuroscience is a relatively young field when you compare it to the other sciences. And finally, how do we bridge these two levels of explanation, right? The biological realm and the first-person realm, or if you will, the first-person experience and the third-person data that we can gather in the field of neuroscience. So just to give a bit of background, DMT is a serotonergic psychedelic. This means that it acts primarily on the serotonin system in the brain. Serotonin is an important neurotransmitter that it's involved in a range of different functions of consciousness. And as you can see here in the two molecules, there's a striking similarity between the DMT molecule and the serotonin molecule. DMT is a fast-acting psychedelic when it's administered intravenously or when it's smoked. Its effects last no longer than 20 minutes, at least the more striking effects, and is known for inducing rich experiences. So there's a lot of content coming out of these experiences. Right? And finally, it's worth mentioning that DMT is part of the Amazonian brew ayahuasca that has been used for ritual purposes and other purposes, sorcery, etc., for hundreds of years. So when DMT is administered orally, when it's ingested in an oral fashion, it's inactive because there's an enzyme in the gut that destroys it. But when it's taken in the combination with the ayahuasca vine, the DMT, this enzyme is inhibited and the effects of DMT are then noticeable. So understanding the biological mechanisms of this is also relevant from the point of view of clinical research. So understanding what are the mechanisms that may underlie some of these effects are important. So this is where we administer DMT to our participants in our study. This is a clinical research facility, so it's usually quite dry. It's not colorful at all. But because we know the importance of these contextual factors, set and setting was mentioned before, the importance that the experience is not only driven by pharmacological effects, but also what's happening in the surroundings of the person, we took extra care to prepare the room and set it up to be as comfortable as possible for people to have these experiences. And as you can see, we recorded brain activity after giving DMT by using the electroencephalogram or the EEG. This is an instrument that allows us to understand brain activity from the point of view of brain waves or brain rhythms. And I'll go into a bit of detail about that in a second. So what is the DMT experience about? When we look at the literature and when we look at users' reports in the internet, we can summarize the effects of DMT as inducing strong effects in the body or somatic effects, inducing strong sense of visual imagery or hallucinations, and very striking, interesting features like sensing presences or entities during these experiences, as well as enhancing a strong sense of reality. So many participants having this sense that what their experience is fundamental, that it has a unique importance, or that it's more real than real. And the overall effects, when we think about people that are taking this substance with their eyes closed usually, and they're detached from the external environment, when they take the drug, these effects can be summarized as generating some sort of virtual space, right? So an alternate reality or a world analog. And this is very interesting. It resembles a lot of what's happening during dreaming. So when we're transitioning into the state of dreaming, we're progressively detaching from what's happening on the outside, and then whatever's coming up in terms of content is internally driven. Right? So in our study, we found that these subjective effects of DMT, the more striking ones, related to visual imagery. So elementary imagery refers to geometrical patterns, and complex imagery relates to more figurative aspects, like seeing faces, houses, streets, etc. Participants also reported a strong sense of disembodiment following the administration of DMT, so a feeling that they were leaving their bodies, as well as what you might call sort of like mystical type aspects of experience. And when we look at the specific items that people rated using questionnaires, we found that this item, experiencing a different reality or dimension, was the most striking one reported by our participants. And these are some of the sketches our participants drew after the sessions. So we asked them to simply try to put on the page or the canvas the most significant visual aspect of their experience. So here you have some examples of simple visual imagery or geometries. A participant reported, "I experienced a field of geometrical shapes, interlocking hexagon-type patterns that moved and had a sense of perspective." These are some examples of complex visual imagery. So now the imagery is no longer related to simple geometrical patterns, but something else is going on. Some objects start to appear, symbols, etc. So I was in a world of Fabergé eggs, which expanded into more Fabergé patterns, and inside each of these eggs there was some sort of cosmic information. So very striking experiences with a lot of visual imagery, which also opens up for us the possibility, from a scientific perspective, to also understand memory, maybe how is the process of image formation formed in the brain by inducing these images in a controlled fashion. So we were also interested in this idea of entities, this experience that many participants feel or report sensing presences during the experience. The idea of entities or sense presences dates back beyond the use of DMT alone, but also within the many cosmovisions of ayahuasca used in the Amazon. So this is a painting by Paulo Amaringo, who was an ayahuasca curandero, an ayahuasca healer from the Vegetalista tradition, and he describes from some of his visions, the visions are so strong that the walls of the house they were in have disappeared, and the Vegetalistas now find themselves in a jungle. There they see their guardian spirits, the mother of the plants. And he then goes on to describe in this painting what each of the spirits and the function that it has within this particular tradition, the Vegetalista tradition, for different healing purposes or even sorcery purposes. Right? We will look at the entity phenomena, the sense presence phenomena within laboratory conditions. We see that some of these reports pop up even at the beginning. So these are some examples of participants that went through some of Stephen Sarra's early experiments. Stephen Sarra was the first person to discover the psychological effects of DMT. So a participant of him recalled, "I have arrived. In front of me are two quiet sunlit gods. They gaze at me and nod in a friendly manner. I think they are welcoming me into this new world. This is Egypt. What wonder. These are the sons of the sun, and I am finally at home." And more than 30 years later, Rick Strassman also described similar encounters in his research with DMT, right? So the elves were prankish and ornery in their nature. It was their territory. They held up placards showing me all this incredibly beautiful, complex, swirling geometrical stuff. And they wanted me to look. It's like they have an agenda. It's like walking into a different neighborhood. So the strong sense of like otherness starts emerging from these narratives. We get a sense that these presences that are encountered during DMT, according to what participants say, they may have some sort of intention. There's an idea that they have a mind of their own. So this is an interesting psychological phenomenon that we were interested in studying in our research. And we found indeed that when we quantified this by using a simple questionnaire, participants were reporting very strong effects of presences. And these encounters having not only like a neutral emotional component, but also both positive and negative aspects, right? So these encounters having a strong emotional valence. These are some of the narratives people gave us. It felt like traveling towards a very benign eye. I had this brief sense of being drawn towards it and being quite conscious. I was then being shown a blackboard, and there are these entities saying, "Have a look at this. It's like a playpen where I'm being watched." I also see hieroglyphic language very much in the center of my vision. Another participant recounted, "I was being shown the interconnectedness. It was as if a presence or something was trying to make me pay attention to lessons so that I could remember them. And a lot of them seemed to be about compassion, gratitude, empathy, and kindness." So a very strong sort of message in this encounter, but also some negative or threatening components, like there were beings that wouldn't allow me to trespass, putting a lot of pressure for me to stay in this side. So this idea of sensing presences also pops up a lot in this interesting psychological phenomenon called the near-death experiences. So near-death experiences are usually perceived as any conscious perceptual event that occurs when a person is on the brink of death, in a close proximity of death. And commonly reported things that some people undergoing these experiences report are feelings of peace, seeing a white light, going through a tunnel, are things that are commonly reported. The interesting thing is that we also know from near-death experiences that these events correlate with some of contextual factors. So for example, the personality traits of people that undergo these experiences are related to how strongly they report them, or their beliefs as well. So we were interested in measuring this, and our results show that when we compare this to a sample of people that had actually undergone near-death experiences, we see that DMT induces very similar phenomena, and that these phenomena relate a lot to this idea of ego dissolution or mystical type experiences. So near-death experiences sharing some sort of common link with the reported phenomena of dissolution of the self or spiritual type of experiences. And we also see that personality traits such as absorption, which relates to the idea of indulgent fantasy, for example, or certain beliefs about the world and reality, predicted how much people were reporting this type of near-death type experiences. So this is an interesting scenario in which not only we are using DMT to understand DMT states in itself, but we are using it also to understand other phenomena that are common in other states of consciousness. All right, so now a bit of brain activity. What did we see in terms of the brain? So in our design, we administered placebo and DMT on separate occasions, and we administered participants one of 3 doses of DMT, a low, a medium, and a high dose. And we had a total of 13 participants. We administered the drug intravenously, and these were all healthy volunteers. And we quantified what was happening in the brain by looking at it in terms of brain rhythms. So the idea of brain rhythms have been intimately linked with the study of consciousness because many of these rhythms relate to different conscious experience. So for example, when people are with their eyes closed, relaxed, this alpha wave starts to become prominent as the dominant rhythm. When people are in a state of higher concentration or more activity, more higher frequencies such as beta start to dominate. And then when we start going or drifting off into sleep, these lower frequencies such as the delta and the theta bands start dominating brain activity. And what we found was that particularly we found a strong reduction in this alpha rhythm, this alpha waves, right? And this is interesting because the idea of alpha waves being prominent or dominant usually relates in a state of relaxed, awake state. People are with their eyes closed, they're detached from the external environment. So this reduction in the alpha wave can be also inferred or can be interpreted as people actively engaging in an environment. So less alpha, more of a sensory sort of stimulation, right? We're also interested in understanding brain activity from using complexity measures or understanding the brain as a complex system. So the idea is that we use a measure that relates to entropy. So the more organized a brain state, the more crystallized it is, the less possibilities it has. By using this measure, after giving DMT, we see that indeed the amount of possible states that the brain can have are much larger. So enhanced possibilities in the brain is a way to interpret these results. And we also see that these entity encounters, sense presences, relate to also reductions in some brain rhythms which are commonly associated to perceiving actions in other or indulging in motor activity. So these are interesting results, but they tell us something that is static. It doesn't really give us a sense of temporal flow of experience. So for that, we had participants, so this is how it took and how we understood things now in time, not just from a static perspective. Participants were lying on their back. We had the EEG on them. You can see the head of the participant there. And then on every passing minute, we asked for an intensity rating after we administered the DMT. So we asked for an intensity, and then people could say something like a 6. And then another intensity rating, and then something like an 8, 0 to 10. And then a third, and by the third minute, people usually gave pretty strong effects. And then we see by minute 20 a gradual return into some sort of baseline normal state of consciousness. And our results show that indeed by the second and third minutes were the more strong effects reported across participants. And when we saw the relationship between brain activity and this progression of effects, we see that the stronger the reduction in this alpha pattern, the stronger the intensity. So this idea that this reduction in the alpha waves are indicating some sort of progressive engagement with what feels for people as a subjective alternate reality. And we also see that this intensity relates to increases in these lower frequencies, like delta and theta, the ones that become prominent when we're transitioning into dreams. And as well in terms of complexity of brain activity. So more entropy, more disorganized activity, more possibilities in terms of brain. Now this is interesting, but we're still in the realm of numbers, and we really wanted to understand what is this flow of experience about, right? The experience is more than just simple an intensity rating, so we know that it's not static either, that it has stages, there is a story, right? So we wanted to understand what is the DMT story about. And the interesting thing is that because DMT is so short, we were able to capture this and hopefully start developing some sort of bridges with what's happening in the brain as well. So for this, we were basically very strongly influenced by the research program that was started by Francisco Varela in the 1990s called Neurophenomenology. The basic idea is that in neuroscience, in cognitive neuroscience, in the science of consciousness, we have a desperate need to get back to experience, to understand experience from an intimate first-person perspective. So the way to do this is to use a disciplined approach. So the person goes through its experience by using this technique that we utilized in our study called microphenomenology. We're tapping into the reports of what's happening at every sort of moment, and we're developing this narrative. So this is an example of a participant. This was done by a collaborator, Rafael Millier. And the basic idea is that we use these intensity ratings to help people go back to the moment in which they were experiencing different aspects of the experience. So here, for example, we could identify when nausea and green lights emerged versus the apparition of feeling shadows by minute 5 or 6, and then the shadows chanting by minute 8, and so forth. So by using this interview method, we then were able to map different dimensions of experience and the progression of the intensity of each of these dimensions. So we saw that at the beginning of the experience there was a strong bodily effect, a somatic effect, and then this was followed by a strong sense of loosening the sense of the body, so this embodiment. And as this was happening, we saw increases in the visual domain. So all this visual imagery started appearing. And once these sensory effects started to go down, we see the emotional, cognitive aspects of experience emerging. So people making sense of what's happening. So by doing this, we were then able to relate what was happening with each of these different dimensions of experience and brain activity. And we find is that we see increases in these lower frequencies and this reduction in the alpha band, which is very similar to happens in the transition into the dream state. These reductions in the beta band, which is similar to what we see in the literature regarding perceiving actions in others or motor actions of ourselves. And finally, in the emotional domain, the increases in complexity measures, this possibility of different brain states. And this is quite consistent with the literature. And right now, what we're doing is we are giving DMT inside of the fMRI scanner so that we can better understand what's happening in terms of brain activity and experience at a much finer detail. So far, although it seems quite frightening to go inside of an fMRI scanner, during this experience, we're actually seeing that there's no adverse effects happening so far, and that the experience is quite safe. And so there's a lot of precautions that we've had to take so that this could happen, like reducing the noise of the scanner, making people feel as comfortable as possible before the session, and so on. So going back to where we started, this conceptualization of human experiences, when we look at the varieties of different possibilities induced by DMT, and we look at the possibilities of understanding what's happening in the brain and also developing these bridges between both of these, we started to really engage with the possibility of looking at experience from a more multidimensional perspective. So experience is not something that could be boiled down to a simple reduced amount of facets. And this sort of notion is really starting to take hold also within the field of philosophy of mind and the science of consciousness. So where do we place these sort of unusual experiences within the usual realm of consciousness, right? And what's happening is that indeed the field is starting to take a more multidimensional approach, looking at experience as a multifaceted phenomena. And to end, I'd like to maybe posit a possibility, is that because we are lacking the contextual, the cultural language to understand these experiences, is that possibly we are marginalizing them to an alternate reality, right? So when the anthropologist Luis Eduardo Luna befriended Pablo Amaringo and asked to Pablo Amaringo, the ayahuasca shaman and painter, how did he interpret these visions that he had, he responded that he didn't conceive of the spiritual realm and the material realm as separate realms, but that they are in fact just one single realm. Then Luis Eduardo Luna interprets this with a phrase by Richard Grossinger and mentions, in certain periods of history and in certain regions, things may be consigned to another world because they do not seem right when they occur. The other world is a way of expressing the complexity and paradox of the relation to us and the more familiar world. They do not require another universe. The universe we are in is vast enough to contain them too. So that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Timmermann. Other questions?
One of the quotes early on from one of the first couple of researchers, there was something about like, I'm finally home. Did you look into at all the possibility of endogenous DMT and whether that feeling of being home was like that sense of re-engaging with the chemical that already, one engages with on one's own?
We haven't looked, we haven't studied specifically endogenous DMT, so it's hard for us to answer that question, but it is a good intuition. It's an interesting intuition that this feeling of homecoming relates to the possibility that we produce endogenously DMT. It's a possibility. Also, the fact that DMT is kind of like a clean, simple molecule, also might have some sort of indication. It acts on a lot of natural neurotransmitters. It seems in a simple sort of way. That may be a possibility, but it's something that needs to be appropriately researched. So it's a bit hard to say at this point.
I'd like to understand what the difference in mechanism of action is between DMT, psilocybin, and LSD and MDMA, because MDMA also acts on the serotonin receptors, on the reuptake, and floods the synapses so that the feedback mechanism from the pituitary shuts off endogenous production of serotonin. How does DMT work differently from this?
I think there was recently a study in which they actually showed that there was a similar action at the serotonin transporter with DMT. But its mechanism of actions have been seen to be blocked specifically by the 2A receptor, at least in the context of ayahuasca, so many of the visual effects. This was a study conducted by Marta Valle and Jordi Riba in Barcelona. So I'd say it's definitely closer to the classic psychedelics, at least in terms of what may be the pharmacodynamics and pharmacokinetics and the psychological effects it produces. But there seems to be something going on also with the serotonin transporter, which is very much in the way that MDMA acts.
What has DMT taught you about the unconscious?
It depends on the conceptualization of the unconscious that you have. If you think in terms of psychodynamic sort of theories, it may be possible that it favors some sort of emergence of psychodynamic material, but which is dressed up in this very colorful, unusual way with the entities and so on. or it may be that, from a Jungian perspective, we may be accessing some sort of archetypical sort of formation. I think it's really hard to tell at this stage. I think that it's kind of like something that we need to dig a bit deeper to really understand how much of these experiences are shared between people and what are the differences and how those personal histories interact with this. And maybe this can tell us a bit more about, how does the personal unconscious or other theories of the unconscious mind might relate to these experiences.
I was wondering, have there been any follow-ups with your participants, like months later, particularly in terms of how they might have been affected in terms of their spiritual beliefs or psychological growth based on their experience?
Yeah, well, we just followed up on the first study 1 week after. So none of these people are psychedelic naive. They've almost all had DMT before. So if we see a change, we probably won't see a major one, unfortunately. So I think, and right now we're conducting surveys in which we have a lot of first-timers taking ayahuasca or DMT, and we're also quite interested in understanding what their views of consciousness and reality and how that may change over time, which can have, both positive and negative or neutral sort of consequences as well. So it's something we're studying, but from a survey sort of perspective, not in these control studies.
At the recent biannual Science of Consciousness at the University of Arizona, a lot of the presenters and researchers seem to be giving more and more credence to panpsychism as a way of looking at consciousness. Have you or any of your associates considered looking at the brain as a receiver of consciousness as opposed to the producer of consciousness?
Not really. I mean, no, but from a sort of like a very agnostic point of view, it's something that it helps us to work with to have this sort of materialistic framework, just because we need to understand a bit the relationship between psychological phenomena and biological phenomena. It's a way of constraining the variables that we work in. So when we think of consciousness as being something that's beyond, it's very difficult to narrow, causal interactions or interaction properties. So we're not looking at it from that perspective specifically. What we are looking at it from, however, is this dual aspect in which experience is equally valuable as what we understand in terms of brain activity. And I think this might relate a bit with the notion you're telling, but we're not having some sort of metaphysical assumption regarding this. We just find these two levels of explanation being equally valuable.
I'm interested in the intersection between quantum mechanics and quantum physics in the study of waves and how that interfaces with how the brain is able to receive different levels of information or to receive information in different ways based on the active state of the brain waves that are existing within the mind. Is this something that your team has examined more closely?
So the idea of this sense of receiving information is certainly something that is reported by many people in our studies. And the way that we look at that, or the intuitions that we have regarding this, is that the brain is in a less crystallized fashion. It's engaging in different possibilities. New connections are formed, and this may somehow relate to the idea of experiencing new information. So new connections relate to the emergence of new material, for example. So this is the way that we, broadly understand it. There seems to be something about the serotonergic psychedelic and the sense of accessing some sort of information that's important that appears to be quite striking. From the quantum physics point of view, I'm not a physicist, and it's definitely beyond the way that I look at the phenomena. Yeah.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. TIMMERMANN.